She had 90 seconds, maybe less. 90 seconds before the woman standing behind them, the woman who'd been slowly poisoning him for weeks, came close enough to hear what she was about to say. Loretta's heart was pounding, but her hands stayed steady. She leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your medicine is poison. She's killing you." For 3 seconds, he didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared at her with an expression that told Loretta he believed every word. Behind them, Yuri smiled. She had no idea that in 6 whispered words, everything had just changed. 6 words. That's all it took to save a life, and risk losing everything. But to understand why a 28-year-old nurse would risk everything to save a man she barely knew, a man whose world was nothing like hers, we need to go back 3 weeks, back to where this whole nightmare really started. Potomac Recovery Center, Bethesda, Maryland. It's one of those medical facilities that doesn't advertise. The kind of place where wealthy patients come for cardiac monitoring without the scrutiny of major hospitals. Marble floors, private rooms, staff who understand that discretion is part of the service. It sits right between Georgetown, where power brokers and business executives keep their townhouses, and the sprawling Korean-American community that runs through the D.C., Maryland area. The patients here value their privacy, and the center makes sure they get it. This is where Loretta Johnson worked 3 evenings a week. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday nights, 7 to midnight, monitoring patients with heart conditions who could afford comfort while they healed. And for Loretta, those shifts were just one piece of an exhausting puzzle. She was 7 months away from finishing her nurse practitioner degree at Georgetown University. 7 months from a finish line she'd been running toward for 6 years. 6 years of a schedule that would have broken most people. Day shifts at Washington Hospital Center. The kind where you're on your feet for 12 hours straight, juggling patient charts, and doctors who barely look up when you're trying to tell them something's wrong. Then evening shifts here at Potomac Recovery 3 nights a week. Classes twice a week at Georgetown, squeezing into lecture halls after a full day of work, fighting to keep her eyes open while professors talked about pharmacology and advanced clinical practice. Clinical rotations on the weekends. Studying at midnight with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Her mother had helped however she could, working extra shifts as a home health aide, picking up overnight cases when the pay was better, making sure Loretta had one less thing to worry about. Her younger brother, still in community college, looked at her like she was proof that the dream still worked, that if you sacrificed enough, worked hard enough, you could actually change your life. The nurse practitioner degree wasn't just about letters after her name, it was about better pay, professional respect, the ability to finally help her family instead of just surviving. She was so close. 7 months close. And then, on a Tuesday evening in early April, she met the patient who would put all of it at risk. April 8th. A cool spring evening, the kind where cherry blossoms were just starting to bloom outside the recovery center's windows. Loretta was assigned to a new patient. Room 6. Cardiac monitoring. 3 times weekly. His name was Hyun Jae. 38 years old. Georgetown address. The intake chart listed him as an import-export businessman, which in a city like D.C. could mean almost anything. He was composed in a way that made Loretta cautious, the kind of calm that came from power, not peace. He took business calls in Korean Rapid, clipped conversations where his voice never rose but somehow still commanded the room, and he was never alone. His fiancée was always with him, Yuri, elegant in that effortless way that came with money, designer handbags, clothes that looked like they'd been tailored specifically for her, hair and makeup that belonged in a magazine spread. She played the role of devoted partner so convincingly that even the hospital staff noticed, always arriving early to his appointments, managing his medication schedule in a leather-bound organizer, adjusting his pillows, bringing him water, asking the nurses gentle questions about his care. The other nurses would smile and say how lucky he was, how rare it was to find someone that devoted. Loretta kept her observations professional, connected him to the cardiac monitoring equipment, recorded his vitals, noted the stress-induced hypertension and early heart failure in his chart, beta blockers and ACE inhibitors prescribed by his cardiologist. Standard protocol, nothing unusual. Except over the next 3 weeks, April 8th, 10th, 15th, 17th, 22nd, 24th, 29th, Loretta started noticing something that didn't make sense. His vitals should have been improving. That's what beta blockers and ACE inhibitors do. They stabilize blood pressure, reduce strain on the heart, give the body time to heal. But Hyun-jae's numbers were going in the wrong direction. His heart rate variability was increasing, blood pressure creeping higher despite medication. He mentioned chest discomfort during one appointment, described it as a tightness that came and went. By late April, he looked more fatigued than he had 3 weeks earlier. Small changes, the kind most people wouldn't notice. But Loretta had been trained to notice, and something about the pattern felt wrong. Before we go any further into what Loretta discovered, and trust me, this story gets darker than you can imagine, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And drop a comment telling me, have you ever noticed something was terribly wrong, something that made your stomach drop, but you were too afraid to speak up? Let me know in the comments. Because Loretta was about to face that exact choice, and what she decided to do next would change 2 lives forever. Tuesday, April 29th. Hyun-jae's appointment ended at 9:15. Yuri walked him out to the waiting car, her hand resting gently on his arm, every inch the concerned fiancé. Loretta waited until they were gone. Then she pulled his chart. She spread 3 weeks of readings across the nurse's station desk. April 8th, April 15th, April 22nd, April 29th, 4 appointments. 4 sets of vitals that should have told a story of gradual improvement. Instead, they told the opposite story. She pulled up his medication log on the computer, the one Yuri meticulously maintained and updated at every visit. Beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, exactly as prescribed by his cardiologist. The dosages were correct, the timing was consistent, so why was he getting worse? Loretta stayed late that night, pulled up medical databases on her phone while sitting in her car in the parking lot, the dome light casting shadows across pages of pharmaceutical research. She searched drug interactions, side effects, toxicology reports, and then she found it: cardiac glycosides. Medications like digoxin used to treat certain heart conditions, but catastrophic in the wrong doses or the wrong situations. The symptoms matched exactly: increased heart rate variability, elevated blood pressure, progressive fatigue, chest discomfort. Someone wasn't giving Hyun-jae his prescribed medication. Someone was giving him digoxin. And in his condition, that would eventually trigger a cardiac event that would look completely natural. Loretta sat in her car for 20 minutes, hands gripped on the steering wheel, trying to convince herself she was wrong. Thursday, May 1st. Yuri arrived 15 minutes before Hyun-jae's appointment, just like she always did. Loretta watched from the nurse's station as Yuri settled into the family lounge, a small room with comfortable chairs and a coffee station, separated from the hallway by a glass wall. Yuri set her designer handbag on the side table, pulled out the medication organizer, that leather-bound planner that looked expensive enough to be from Coach or Michael Kors, and then she pulled out something else, a small unmarked bottle. Loretta's breath caught. Yuri's movements were quick, practiced. She opened the medication organizer, the compartments labeled with days of the week, and systematically removed pills, replaced them with pills from the unmarked bottle, tucked the original pills into a small zippered pouch inside her handbag. The whole process took maybe 60 seconds. Efficient, deliberate, like she'd done it 100 times before. Loretta stood frozen at the nurse's station, pretending to review a chart, her heart pounding so hard she was sure someone would hear it. When Yuri finished, she tucked everything away, pulled out her phone, and started scrolling through what looked like Instagram. Casual, calm, like she hadn't just switched out medication that was slowly killing the man she claimed to love. Loretta needed proof. Real proof. Not just what she'd seen through a glass wall. Tuesday, May 6th. Hyun-jae's appointment. Yuri excused herself halfway through, stepped out to use the restroom, leaving her handbag on the chair beside the bed. Loretta waited 30 seconds, then moved quickly. She opened the medication organizer, used her phone to photograph the pills inside, made sure the lighting was good enough to see the markings clearly, then closed it and stepped back to the monitoring equipment before Yuri returned. That night, sitting at her kitchen table with a mug of chamomile tea from the box her mother had bought her at Target, Loretta pulled up pill identification databases online. She entered the markings, the shape, the color. The results came back within seconds. Not lisinopril, not metoprolol, digoxin. Loretta closed her laptop and sat in the quiet of her apartment, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic outside her window. She'd been right. Yuri was poisoning him. The weekend, May 10th and 11th, was the longest of Loretta's life. She tried to study for her upcoming exams, couldn't focus, tried to sleep, lay awake staring at the ceiling instead, running through scenarios in her head. Every option felt catastrophic. She could report it through official channels, file a concern with the medical director, trigger an investigation, but that meant testimony, scrutiny, probable termination. Her clinical supervisor already didn't like her, had called her difficult for questioning a doctor's orders last month. If she made waves now, even if she was right, she'd be the nurse who caused problems. The one hospitals quietly refused to hire. And if she was wrong, if there was some explanation she hadn't considered, she'd be fired for making reckless accusations against a patient's family member. Her degree, 7 months away, would become meaningless. No one hires a nurse with a termination on their record. But if she was right and did nothing, she'd be watching a man die. Slowly, deliberately, while she stood by and let it happen. And then there was the other fear. The one she didn't want to name, but couldn't ignore. Hyun-jae's security guards, the way the staff deferred to him. The business calls in Korean that sounded like someone giving orders, not taking them. If his world was as dangerous as it seemed, and she went public with accusations against his fiancé, what would happen to her? Loretta thought about her grandmother. 16 years ago now. But the memory was still sharp. A medication error at the nursing home. A nurse who noticed the doctor's order didn't match the patient's condition. But she'd been too intimidated to speak up. Didn't want to question the doctor. Didn't want to cause problems. Loretta's grandmother died 3 days later, from complications that could have been prevented. She'd been 16, sitting in that hospital room, watching her grandmother slip away, listening to her mother sob, and she'd made herself a promise that day. She would never stay silent when she saw something wrong. Not ever. That promise had guided her through nursing school, through difficult shifts where she'd advocated for patients even when doctors rolled their eyes, through moments where speaking up cost her professionally, and now that promise was about to cost her everything she'd worked for. By Monday night, May 12th, Loretta had made her decision. She wouldn't go through official channels, wouldn't file reports or trigger investigations. She'd warn Hyun-jae directly, tell him what she'd discovered, give him the choice of what to do with the information. It was the only way to save him without destroying her own future. The only way to keep her promise to herself without losing everything. She had proof. She had a plan. Now she just had to find the courage to whisper 6 words to a man who might have her killed for knowing too much, and hope that he'd believe her. Tuesday, May 13th, 7:30 in the evening. Hyun-jae's appointment was scheduled for 8 o'clock, like always. Loretta arrived early for her shift, changed into her scrubs in the staff locker room, and stood at the bathroom sink for a full minute, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. By 8:05, Hyun-jae was settled in room 6. Yuri in her usual spot, the chair beside the bed, handbag at her feet, already pulling out the medication organizer. Loretta connected him to the cardiac monitoring equipment, blood pressure cuff, pulse oximeter, heart rate monitor. Her movements were automatic, professional. She'd done this 1,000 times. But tonight, the air in the room felt different. Heavy. Like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. Yuri watched her with that pleasant, polite expression she always wore. Made small talk about the weather, about traffic on the Beltway, about how grateful she was for the excellent care Hyun-jae was receiving. Loretta smiled and nodded, and felt her heartbeat pounding in her ears. And then, at 8:17, Yuri's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, her expression shifting slightly. "I'm sorry. I need to take this." Her voice was apologetic as she stood, already moving toward the door. "Work emergency." She stepped into the hallway, the door closing softly behind her. Through the glass panel, Loretta could see her phone pressed to her ear, still visible, still watching the room, but far enough away that she wouldn't hear a quiet conversation. 90 seconds, maybe less. Loretta moved to adjust the blood pressure cuff, her hands gentle on Hyun-jae's arm. She leaned close, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your medicine is poison. She's killing you." Hyun-jae's entire body went still. Not the kind of stillness that comes from surprise, the kind that comes from someone who's just had their world rearranged and is calculating every possible response in the span of a heartbeat. His eyes sharpened. The shift from composed patient to something else, something lethal and focused, happened so fast Loretta almost stepped back. For 3 seconds, he didn't breathe. just stared at her with an intensity that made her feel like he was seeing straight through to her intentions, her fears, her proof. Then he nodded, once, almost imperceptibly. In the hallway, Yuri finished her call. She tucked her phone into her coat pocket and turned back toward the room, her expression pleasant again, completely unchanged. She pushed open the door and smiled at them. Sorry about that. Where were we? Loretta stepped back to the monitoring equipment, her voice steady. Blood pressure is looking stable tonight. Yuri settled back into her chair, pulled out her phone and started scrolling, probably Instagram or Pinterest. Something to pass the time during the appointment. She had no idea that in 6 whispered words, everything had just changed. For Hyunjae, the world had shattered. The woman sitting 3 feet away from him. The woman he'd trusted with his medications, with his vulnerability during illness, with access to his life when he was at his weakest, was systematically killing him. But he didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't give Yuri any reason to suspect that something had shifted. Years of navigating dangerous situations had taught him one critical lesson: never show your hand until you're ready to strike. So he sat quietly, made appropriate responses when Yuri spoke to him, and let his mind work through the implications, while his face remained calm. Over the next 3 appointments, Thursday, May 16th, Saturday, May 18th, Tuesday, May 20th, Hyunjae and Loretta executed their quiet plan. When Yuri stepped out bathroom breaks, phone calls, a quick trip to the hospital coffee shop for a latte, they talked in hushed, urgent voices. Hyunjae started palming the pills Yuri gave him, slipping them into his pocket instead of swallowing them, disposing of them later, flushing them down the toilet at home when she wasn't watching. Loretta provided his actual prescribed medication during appointments, beta blockers and ACE inhibitors measured out in careful doses, hidden inside routine equipment checks, slipped to him in moments when Yuri's attention was elsewhere. To everyone else, Hyunjae appeared to be declining further. He let himself look more fatigued, moved a little slower. During the May 18th appointment, he slurred his words slightly when answering the physician's questions, just enough to seem concerning. The performance was so convincing that by May 20th, his cardiologist was suggesting they consider adjusting his treatment plan, or possibly admitting him for more intensive observation. Yuri looked appropriately worried, held his hand, asked the doctor gentle, concerned questions about what could be done. Loretta watched it all and felt something cold settle in her chest. But during those stolen moments, the brief windows when Yuri stepped away, something unexpected started to happen. Hyunjae talked to Loretta, really talked, not only about the poisoning, or the plan, or the evidence, about loneliness. He told her what it was like to be surrounded by people, but known by no one, to have power and wealth and respect, but no one he could be honest with, no one who saw him as anything other than a resource or a threat. Loretta told him about exhaustion, about sacrificing everything for a degree that was supposed to change her life, about working herself to the bone for 6 years, while watching her mother do the same, both of them chasing a version of stability that always seemed just out of reach. They recognized something in each other, a kind of profound loneliness that had nothing to do with being alone, and everything to do with never being truly seen. It was strange, forming this fragile trust in whispered conversations, stolen between heart rate readings and blood pressure checks. But it was real. While Loretta documented medical evidence, photographing pill bottles, recording vitals, building a paper trail that could save Hyunjae's life if it came to that, he was conducting his own investigation. He had resources, contacts in Seoul, people who owed him favors. He started tracing Yuri's background, her family, her brother's sudden gambling debts that had appeared out of nowhere 14 months ago, the communications patterns between her phone and numbers registered in South Korea. Piece by piece, he started building a picture of why the woman he'd planned to marry had decided he needed to die. Now, let me ask you something. If someone you loved was poisoning you, someone you trusted completely, would you confront them immediately? Or would you gather evidence first? Make sure you understood the full scope of the betrayal before you acted. Think about that, and let me know in the comments what you would do. Because Hyunjae was about to discover something that would make this betrayal so much worse than he'd imagined. The conspiracy was active. Loretta and Hyunjae were working together, moving in careful synchronization to keep him alive, while they uncovered the truth. But the question that haunted both of them, whispered in those stolen moments when Yuri stepped out of the room, was simple. Why? Why would Yuri do this? What could possibly be worth murdering the man she'd agreed to marry? And how far did this betrayal really go? Early June. 3 weeks after Loretta's whispered warning, Hyun-jae's investigation had been methodical, quiet, the kind of work that happened in encrypted messages and phone calls made from rooms where he knew he wouldn't be overheard. He had people in Seoul, contacts who understood how to ask questions without drawing attention, and slowly, carefully, they'd started pulling threads. What they found was a story that began 14 months earlier. Yuri's younger brother, Jun Seo, was 23 years old, a graduate student in Seoul. Smart kid, by all accounts. Focused on his studies, close with his family, no history of trouble, until he started showing up at underground poker games in Gangnam. The games themselves weren't unusual. Plenty of young men in Seoul played cards for money, testing their luck and their nerve. But Jun Seo's debts accumulated fast. Too fast. Within 6 weeks, he owed money to people who didn't accept excuses or payment plans. What Hyun-jae's contacts discovered was that Jun Seo's debts hadn't been accidental. He'd been targeted, deliberately, by a rival faction that had been looking for leverage against Hyun-jae's operations in the DC area. They'd engineered Jun Seo's gambling losses, made sure he kept playing, made sure he kept losing. And when the debt reached a point where it couldn't be ignored, they'd made Yuri an offer. Marry Hyun-jae, provide intelligence about his business operations, or watch her brother die, and her parents lose everything they'd worked for. The engagement happened in August. Hyun-jae remembered it clearly. He'd been tired of being alone, tired of surface-level conversations and relationships built on fear or obligation. Yuri had seemed different, educated, cultured, interested in building something real. He'd proposed because he thought maybe, finally, he'd found someone who wanted partnership, not just proximity to power. But for Yuri, the engagement had been transactional from the very beginning. A trade. Her freedom and her brother's life in exchange for access to Hyun-jae's world. She was isolated, terrified, trapped in a situation where every choice led to someone she loved getting hurt. And then, during the engagement, she met Min-ho. He was her handler, the person assigned by the rival faction to manage her, to collect the intelligence she was supposed to be gathering, to make sure she stayed compliant. But somewhere along the way, Yuri fell in love with him. It was desperate. Hidden. The kind of affair that happened in hotel rooms booked under false names, in stolen moments when Hyun-jae was traveling for business, in late-night phone calls where she convinced herself that Min-ho understood her pain. He told her he loved her, promised her they'd find a way out, made her believe that maybe, just maybe, there was an escape from the nightmare her life had become. In March, Yuri discovered she was pregnant, Min-ho's child. The timeline made it impossible to pass the baby off as Hyun-jae's. They'd stopped being intimate months earlier, his declining health, the stress of his condition, the distance that had grown between them, without either of them quite acknowledging it. Yuri was maybe 10 weeks along when she took the test, sitting in the bathroom of a CVS near DuPont Circle, hands shaking as she watched the second line appear. She had 6 weeks, maybe 8, before symptoms became harder to hide, before her body started changing in ways she couldn't explain away. When the pregnancy showed around 12 to 16 weeks, sometime in early July, her betrayal would be exposed. The rival faction would know she'd failed to remain useful. Hyun-jae would know she'd been lying all along. Jun Seo would be killed. Her parents would be destroyed. Every option led to catastrophe, except one. If Hyun-jae died before her pregnancy became visible, she'd inherit. As his fiancée, she was named in his will, a gesture he'd made months earlier, back when he still believed they were building a future together. The inheritance would be enough to buy Jun Seo's freedom from the faction, enough to start over somewhere far from all of this. She and Min-ho could leave, build a life, raise their child away from the violence and manipulation that had brought them together. The digoxin substitution would trigger a cardiac event that looked completely natural. A man with a known heart condition, dying despite treatment. Tragic, but not suspicious. No one would suspect. Yuri started switching the pills in early April. Every time she did it, guilt consumed her. But she told herself she was the victim, that she'd been forced into impossible circumstances, that she was doing what she had to do to survive. But what Yuri didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Min-ho's love had been part of the plan all along. Hyun-jae's investigation revealed the cruelest truth. Min-ho had been assigned to seduce her, to deepen her emotional investment, to give her a reason to stay desperate enough to take extreme measures. The pregnancy hadn't been an accident. It had been calculated. Time to force her hand, to push her toward a timeline where murder became her only solution. The rival faction wanted Hyunjae dead, and Minho's job had been to make Yuri desperate enough to do it. Every stolen moment, every whispered promise, every time he'd told her he loved her, it had all been performance. Manipulation designed to turn a terrified woman into a killer. Yuri wasn't a psychopath. She wasn't evil. She was a woman who'd been handed impossible choices and made the worst ones, who'd fallen in love with someone assigned to destroy her, who'd convinced herself that murder was survival, that she was protecting her family, that the man she was killing was just another obstacle between her and freedom. Every time she switched the pills, sitting in that family lounge at Potomac Recovery, with her leather planner and her expensive handbag, she carried the weight of it, the guilt, the fear, the desperate hope that maybe this would work. Maybe she'd finally escape. But she was never going to escape. Because the people using her had no intention of letting her go. She was a tool, expendable. And when she'd served her purpose, they would have discarded her just like they'd discarded everyone else who'd outlived their usefulness. Hyunjae sat in his Georgetown study on a Sunday evening in early June, the investigation files spread across his desk, and felt something unexpected. Not just rage, not just betrayal, pity. Yuri had tried to kill him. That was undeniable. But she'd been manipulated into it, by people far more ruthless than she'd ever be. The question now was, what to do with this information. He could destroy her, expose everything, have her arrested for attempted murder, make sure she spent decades in prison, while her family fell apart and the faction that had used her walked away clean. Or he could do something more complicated. Something that would cost him nothing, and might break the cycle of victims becoming villains. The choice was his. He made the call on Saturday evening. Yuri's voice had been bright when she answered, cheerful in that practiced way she'd perfected over the past year. "Tomorrow morning?" she'd said. "Of course, I'd love to go over the wedding plans." Sunday morning arrived cool and clear. June sunshine filtered through the tall windows of Hyunjae's Georgetown townhouse, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors of his private study. The room was elegant in an understated way. Dark wood furniture, leather chairs that looked like they belonged in a lawyer's office, bookshelves lined with volumes that were actually read, not just displayed. But despite the warmth of the morning light, the space felt cold. Hyunjae sat behind his desk, the investigation files arranged in a neat folder in front of him. He'd been awake since 5, running through the conversation in his mind, anticipating her reactions, preparing himself for what needed to happen. At 9:30, the doorbell rang. Yuri arrived wearing a cream-colored sweater, the kind from Banana Republic that looked expensive without being showy, and tailored pants. Her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail. She carried a Kate Spade planner, the one she used for wedding details, tucked under her arm. She smiled as she stepped into the study. "I brought fabric samples for the table linens. I know we said we'd wait, but I found the most beautiful. Sit down, Yuri." Something in his voice made her stop mid-sentence. The smile faltered, just slightly, but she recovered quickly, set her planner on the side table, and settled into the chair across from his desk. "Is everything all right?" Hyunjae placed the folder on the desk between them. Didn't open it yet, just let it sit there, an unspoken threat. "I know about the poisoning." His voice was calm, terrifyingly calm. "I know about Minho. I know about the baby. I know about Junseo." The color drained from Yuri's face so quickly it looked like someone had pulled a plug. Her hands gripped the armrests of the chair. I don't know what you're—" He opened the folder, slid the first photograph across the desk. It was time-stamped. May 1st, 7:43 p.m. Yuri, in the family lounge at Potomac Recovery, the medication organizer open in front of her, the unmarked bottle in her hand. The angle was perfect, clear, undeniable. She stared at it, said nothing. He slid the next set of documents across. Communications records, text messages between her phone and a number registered in Seoul. Dates, times, fragments of conversations that made it clear this wasn't a romance, it was an operation. Then the evidence of Junseo's debts. The trail of transactions, showing how deliberately they'd been engineered. the names of the men from the rival faction who'd orchestrated it. And finally, a medical document. 10 weeks pregnant. Dated from a clinic in Bethesda she'd visited under a false name. Yuri's breathing had gone shallow. Her hands were shaking. "You were being used by everyone, Yuri." Hyunjae's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it now. Not anger. Something sadder. "Your brother's debt was manufactured. They targeted him specifically to get to me. And Minho," he paused. "Minho was assigned to seduce you. The pregnancy wasn't an accident. It was designed to force your timeline, to make you desperate enough to do exactly what you did." He slid one last document across the desk. A report from his contacts in Seoul. Evidence that Minho had been reporting her emotional state to the faction weekly. Detailed notes about her fears, her guilt, her growing attachment to him. "Even your love was a weapon pointed at both of us." For the first time, Yuri's carefully constructed facade shattered. Not with screaming, not with denial, just a kind of hollow devastation that made her look suddenly smaller, younger, like the scared woman she'd been all along, hiding beneath expensive clothes and perfect makeup. "I thought," her voice cracked, "I thought he loved me." Hyunjae leaned back in his chair. The morning light caught the edge of the desk, illuminating the documents spread between them, like evidence at a trial. "You have two choices," he said quietly. "Face attempted murder charges, decades in prison, your family destroyed by the scandal. Junseo left to whatever the faction decides to do with him." He paused. "Or you leave today. I'll wire you $500,000. Enough to buy Junseo's freedom. Enough to start over somewhere far from here. But you cut all ties with Minho, with the faction. You disappear, and you never come back." Yuri looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. Her mascara, probably Maybelline, the waterproof kind that was supposed to last, was smudging at the corners of her eyes. "Why?" The word came out broken. "Why would you let me go?" Hyunjae was quiet for a long moment. Outside, he could hear the distant sound of someone mowing their lawn, a dog barking, the ordinary sounds of a Sunday morning in Georgetown. "Because the woman who saved my life taught me to see people clearly." He met Yuri's eyes. "You're not evil, Yuri. You're desperate. You were used by people more ruthless than you'll ever be." He paused. "And I'm tired of being part of cycles where victims become villains. Walk away. Free your brother. Build something real." By 6 o'clock that evening, Yuri was gone. A single suitcase, a wire transfer confirmation, a signed agreement, notarized that afternoon, that she would never contact him or return to the United States. Hyunjae stood in his study as the sun set, painting the room in shades of amber and shadow. The folder was still on his desk. The evidence of betrayal. The proof of mercy. He didn't feel triumph. Just a profound loneliness, mixed with something that might have been relief. The woman who'd tried to kill him was gone. And in her place was only the quiet of an empty house, and the knowledge that he'd chosen something harder than revenge. He'd chosen to let her go. The weeks that followed moved quietly, like the careful steps someone takes when learning to walk again after an injury. Yuri kept her word. By the second week of June, Hyunjae's contacts confirmed that Junseo's debt had been cleared. The rival faction had received their payment and released their claim. 3 days later, Yuri's phone number went dead. No forwarding information. No trail except a single notation in an immigration database. A flight to Vancouver, Canada. On June 15th, she disappeared the way people do when they want to be forgotten. Hyunjae returned to taking his actual medication. Beta blockers. ACE inhibitors. The prescriptions his cardiologist had written months ago, before everything had spiraled into betrayal and whispered warnings. Within 4 weeks, his vitals began to stabilize. His blood pressure dropped back into normal range. The heart rate variability that had been climbing steadily throughout May started to level out. The fatigue that had made every afternoon feel like wading through water lifted. At his follow-up appointment in mid-July, his physician looked genuinely baffled. "I don't know what changed," the doctor said, scrolling through the chart on his tablet. "But whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Your numbers haven't looked this good in 6 months." Hyunjae had simply nodded. "Less stress, I think. The engagement ended. It's been quieter." The doctor had made a note about stress reduction and moved on to discussing diet and exercise, completely unaware that the real answer was far simpler. No one was poisoning him anymore. Loretta continued working her shifts at Potomac Recovery. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday evenings, 7 to midnight. But for the first few weeks after Yuri's departure, she avoided Hyunjae's appointments. She'd swap shifts with other nurses, cite scheduling conflicts, find reasons to be assigned to different patients. It wasn't that she regretted what she'd done. Saving his life had been the right choice. The only choice. But the intensity of it had left her drained. Every time she saw his name on the schedule, her heart rate spiked. Too much fear, too much risk, too many nights lying awake wondering if she'd made the right call, or if she'd just painted a target on her own back. But Hyunjae kept coming, Tuesday and Thursday evenings, like clockwork, and he didn't make it difficult. He simply arranged his appointments to fall during her shifts, then waited to see if she'd be the one monitoring him. When she finally stopped avoiding him in late June, a Tuesday evening when she was the only nurse available, he didn't mention it, just settled into the chair, let her connect the equipment, and asked her a question that caught her off guard. "How's your exam prep going? You mentioned comprehensive exams were coming up." She'd blinked at him. "You remember that? You told me during one of our conversations in May. I think it was the 16th. You said they were scheduled for September." He'd remembered, not just the exams, but the date she'd mentioned them. It became a pattern. He'd ask about her NP program, about which rotation she was dreading most, about whether she'd decided on a specialty focus yet. Small questions, thoughtful ones, the kind that showed he'd actually been listening during those whispered conversations, when they'd been conspiring to keep him alive. And then, one Saturday evening in early July, he showed up 15 minutes before his appointment with a coffee. Not from some fancy cafe. Just a medium Dunkin' Donuts iced coffee, 2 creams, 1 sugar. Her exact order from the hospital cafeteria. "Thought you might need this before your shift," he'd said, setting it on the nurse's station counter. Loretta had stared at it. "How did you—" "You mentioned it once, that you always grabbed coffee before evening shifts, but the hospital cafeteria closes at 6:30 on weekends, so Saturdays you had to settle for the vending machine." He'd remembered that too. Mid-July, after an appointment where his vitals had come back perfectly stable, he'd asked her to dinner. Not in a dramatic way. Just a quiet question as she was disconnecting the monitoring equipment. "Would you have dinner with me sometime? Just to talk. Nothing complicated." Loretta had felt her stomach flip. Part attraction, part terror. "I don't think that's a good idea," she'd said carefully. "Professional boundaries." He'd nodded, understood, and that was it. No pushing, no follow-up, just acceptance. But it had stayed with her. The question. The way he'd asked it like he was offering something, not demanding it. For weeks, Loretta carried the conflict inside her like a weight. She was attracted to him. That was undeniable. But he represented everything that terrified her. Danger. Secrecy. A world where people got killed over business dealings and betrayal was currency. She was 5 months from finishing her degree. 5 months from everything she'd worked toward for 6 years. Why would she risk entanglement with someone whose life looked like a crime thriller? But she also couldn't ignore what she'd seen in those whispered conversations. The loneliness, the way he'd looked at her when she'd warned him not with suspicion, but with immediate trust. The respect he showed her, not because of what she could do for him, but because of who she was. He didn't try to buy her affection, didn't show up with jewelry or expensive gifts, just coffee, and questions, and the quiet patience of someone willing to wait. Late August brought the crisis Loretta had been dreading for years. Her mother collapsed at work. A pre-diabetic crisis that had been building for months, irregular blood sugar, stress from overtime shifts, too many missed meals because she'd been trying to save money for Loretta's graduation. The hospital admitted her for observation. Loretta spent 2 days sitting beside her bed in the same Washington hospital center where she worked day shifts, holding her mother's hand, and feeling like everything was falling apart. On the 3rd day, Hyunjae showed up. Not in her mother's room. He waited in the hallway until Loretta stepped out for coffee, then approached carefully. "I heard what happened," he said. "I wanted to help." Loretta had been too exhausted to ask how he'd found out. Hospital networks, contacts. It didn't matter. "We're managing," she'd said. "I know you are. But I arranged a consultation with an endocrinologist I know, Dr. Sarah Kim, over at Johns Hopkins. No charge professional courtesy. And I'm having meal services delivered to your mother's apartment for the next 2 weeks. Freshly prepared meals, the kind from Factor that follow diabetic guidelines. Just to take one thing off your plate while she recovers. Loretta had stared at him. Not flowers, not money, just practical, actionable help. Why would you do this? His answer had been simple. You saved my life. This is the least I can do. Early September. A Tuesday evening. Loretta finally agreed to dinner. Not somewhere expensive or showy. A quiet Korean barbecue place in Annandale, Virginia, the kind with wooden tables and metal grills built into the center, where the servers brought out banchan in little white dishes, and the air smelled like sesame oil and grilled meat. They talked about everything except the poisoning. Loretta told him about her dream of opening a community clinic in an underserved neighborhood, sliding scale fees, focus on preventive care for people who couldn't afford it otherwise. Hyun-jae told her about the loneliness of his work, how he was surrounded by people but known by none of them. They discovered they both loved old noir films, the kind with sharp dialogue and moral ambiguity, where heroes weren't always heroic and villains sometimes had their reasons. And somewhere between the bulgogi and the second round of soju, Loretta laughed. Genuinely. Freely. The kind of laughter that comes when you realize you're exactly where you want to be. Now, let me ask you something. Would you give someone from a dangerous world a real chance if they genuinely respected and cared for you? If they saw you clearly and valued who you were, not just what you could do for them? Think about that. And let me know in the comments what you'd do. Because for Loretta, the choice was starting to feel less terrifying, and more like something she might actually want. But what neither of them knew as they sat in that quiet restaurant, building something fragile and real, was that Yuri's story wasn't quite finished. The past has a way of coming back, even when you think it's finally gone. October arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Washington beautiful. Leaves turning gold and red along the Georgetown streets. Pumpkin displays outside the Trader Joe's on Wisconsin Avenue, the promise of change in the air. Loretta was 2 months from graduation. 2 months from finally becoming Loretta Johnson, FNPC. 2 months from everything she'd worked toward for 6 years. She and Hyun-jae had been seeing each other quietly. Dinner once a week, sometimes twice. Coffee on Sunday mornings at a little place in DuPont Circle. Nothing dramatic. Just two people learning each other's rhythms, building something careful and real. And then, on a Thursday afternoon in mid-October, the registered letter arrived. Loretta had just finished a 12-hour shift at Washington Hospital Center. She was still in her scrubs, the navy blue figs set her mother had bought her last Christmas, when she checked her mailbox and found the thick envelope with a law firm's return address embossed in the corner. She opened it standing in the hallway of her apartment building. The letterhead was from a firm in Rockville. Expensive. The kind that charged $400 an hour and had offices with marble lobbies. They were representing Yuri. The claim was simple and devastating. Loretta Johnson had made false accusations that led to the wrongful termination of Miss Yuri's engagement to their client's former fiancé, causing severe emotional distress and financial harm. Miss Yuri was seeking $500,000 in damages. And if the matter couldn't be resolved quickly, they intended to file complaints with the Maryland Board of Nursing. Professional misconduct, unauthorized access to patient records, breach of confidentiality. Loretta's hands started shaking before she finished the first page. By the following Tuesday, Yuri had leaked her version to Korean-American news outlets. The story spread quickly through community newspapers and online platforms. The angle was sympathetic and brutal. Jealous nurse destroys engagement with lies. Yuri painted herself as the victim, a devoted fiancé who'd cared for her partner through illness, only to be driven away by a nurse who developed an inappropriate attachment. No mention of poisoning. No mention of manipulation or murder attempts. Just character assassination wrapped in the language of betrayal. Loretta's photo appeared in the articles, her full name, her workplace. The comment sections exploded. People who'd never met her called her a homewrecker, accused her of using her position to manipulate vulnerable patients, demanded she be fired, prosecuted, banned from nursing. Loretta sat in her apartment that evening, laptop open to the third article featuring her face, and felt the walls closing in. This was her nightmare. An investigation by the Maryland Board of Nursing could delay her graduation in December. Even if she was eventually cleared, the stain on her record would follow her. Hospital HR departments would see the complaint when they ran background checks. Job offers would evaporate. 6 years of sacrifice reduced to a cautionary tale. about nurses who overstepped boundaries. On Wednesday morning, her clinical supervisor at Potomac Recovery called her into the office. "We need to discuss some concerns that have been raised." The supervisor's voice was professionally neutral, but her expression was cold. She'd never liked Loretta, had called her difficult more than once for questioning protocols. Now she had ammunition. Loretta called Hyun-jae that evening. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the fear underneath. "She's suing me, and she's trying to destroy my nursing license." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Hyun-jae spoke, his voice was colder than Loretta had ever heard it. Not angry at her, furious at Yuri. "She signed away her right to make claims. This violates our agreement." He paused. "I'll handle this. Don't respond to anyone. Don't make statements. Let me take care of it." By mid-October, Hyun-jae's legal team had moved into action. They released a controlled statement brief, factual, devastating. "Miss Yuri voluntarily ended her engagement to our client in June 2026 due to personal matters unrelated to any third party. Miss Yuri accepted a substantial financial settlement in exchange for mutual non-disparagement and an agreement not to make claims against our client or any parties associated with him. The current allegations violate that agreement and will be met with appropriate legal consequences." Attached to the statement were documents. The signed agreement, notarized and dated June 7th. Wire transfer records showing Yuri had received $500,000. Her own written acknowledgement that she was leaving for personal reasons and would not pursue future claims. The evidence was ironclad. Simultaneously, Potomac Recovery's legal team at Hyun-jae's quiet request provided documentation to the Maryland Board of Nursing. Medical records showing Hyun-jae's symptom deterioration throughout April and May. Loretta's nursing notes documenting concerns about medication efficacy. Expert testimony that her observations were medically justified and her actions fell squarely within the scope of nursing responsibility. Most importantly, she hadn't breached confidentiality. She'd reported her concerns directly to the patient himself, not to external parties. That was not only appropriate, it was exactly what nursing protocols recommended when family members might be involved in patient harm. The response was swift. Within 2 weeks, Yuri's attorney sent a brief letter withdrawing the lawsuit. No explanation, just a terse notification that Miss Yuri would not be pursuing the matter further. The Maryland Board of Nursing closed their preliminary inquiry with a letter that arrived in Loretta's mailbox on a rainy Tuesday morning. She opened it standing in her kitchen, still wearing her Target pajamas, coffee brewing in her old Mr. Coffee machine. The letter was short, professional. They'd reviewed the complaint and supporting documentation. They found Loretta's actions to be medically justified and consistent with professional nursing standards. The matter was closed. The final paragraph made her throat tight. "The board commends your diligent patient advocacy. This is the standard of care we expect from Maryland nurses." News outlets quietly retracted their stories. Some posted brief corrections. Most just deleted the articles and moved on to the next scandal. Within 3 weeks of Yuri's attack, it was over. Loretta's career was safe. Her graduation still on track for December. The threat neutralized as efficiently as it had appeared. But that Thursday evening, sitting across from Hyun-jae, at a small Italian place in Arlington, red-checkered tablecloths and breadsticks in paper-lined baskets, Loretta felt the weight of what had just happened. "She tried to destroy me," Loretta said quietly. "Even after you let her go. Even after you gave her money to start over. She still came after me." Hyun-jae reached across the table, took her hand. His grip was warm, steady. She was desperate, and desperate people make terrible choices. He paused. "But it's over now. She violated the agreement. Her lawyer made it clear that if she tries anything else, she loses everything, including the money she used to free her brother." Loretta nodded, but something had shifted. She'd been naive, she realized, to think mercy meant safety, that choosing compassion over revenge would somehow make the threat disappear. The world didn't work that way. "Are you okay?" Hyun-jae asked. Loretta looked at him. This man who'd moved mountains to protect her, who'd used his resources and connections not for revenge, but for defense, who'd kept his word even when it would have been easier to destroy Yuri completely. "I'm okay," she said, and meant it. The threat was gone. Her career was safe. But the question that lingered, the one neither of them spoke out loud, was simpler. What did this cost them? And where did they go from here? Late November brought the exam Loretta had been preparing for, since she'd started the NP program 6 years ago. The boards, 3 hours, 200 questions. She sat in the testing center in Silver Spring on a gray Tuesday morning, surrounded by other candidates who looked just as nervous, just as desperate for this to finally be over. When she submitted her final answer, and the screen went blank, she sat there for a moment, hands in her lap, hardly believing it was done. The results came 10 days later. She was standing in the pharmacy aisle at CVS when the email notification appeared on her phone. Congratulations. You have successfully passed the Family Nurse Practitioner Certification Examination. Loretta Johnson, FNPC. Her mother threw a small party that Saturday, a sheet cake from Giant with "Congratulations, Loretta," written in blue icing. Her younger brother gave a toast that made everyone tear up. Everything she'd worked for, it had led here. Hyunjae didn't attend, it felt too soon to introduce him to her family. But on Monday morning, flowers arrived. White lilies and pale blue hydrangeas. The card was handwritten. "You did this yourself. I'm just grateful I get to witness it. Proud of you. HJ." Early December, Hyunjae invited her to his Georgetown townhouse for dinner. He'd cook, he said, or attempt to. She arrived wearing jeans and the Nordstrom cashmere sweater her mother had bought her as a graduation gift. He opened the door in a dark gray Henley and jeans. No tie. No business calls. Just him. They sat in his study, the same room where he'd confronted Yuri, but the energy was entirely different now. The desk was clear. Just 2 chairs near the window, where Georgetown's evening lights glowed soft against the glass. "I need to tell you something," he said. "I've spent 20 years surrounded by people whose loyalty I purchased through fear or money. You're the first person who chose to save me when it cost you everything. I don't know how to do this. Relationships where trust isn't transactional, but I want to learn. With you." Loretta took a breath. "Your world scares me. The danger, the secrets, Yuri trying to destroy my career. I don't know if I can live like that." "I know," he said quietly. "Can you promise me safety?" He shook his head. "No, I can't. But I can promise you transparency, honesty, and I'll never ask you to compromise your principles. If you say this is too much, I'll respect that. But if you're willing to try, I'll spend every day proving you didn't choose wrong." She looked at him. This man who'd kept his word, who'd protected her without asking for anything in return. "Okay," she said. "Let's try." They moved to the kitchen. He pulled out ingredients: chicken, vegetables, olive oil from Williams Sonoma that looked like a gift. "What are we making?" Loretta asked. "Stir fry. How hard can it be?" She laughed, took the knife from him. "Watch." She showed him how to dice onions, mince garlic, get the pan hot enough. At one point, he burned the garlic. The kitchen filled with acrid smoke, and Loretta laughed so hard she had to lean against the counter. "It's not funny," he said, but he was smiling too. They started over. This time she guided his hand, showing him the right motion for sautéing vegetables. By the time they sat down at his kitchen table, the food was actually good. "I want to open a community clinic," Loretta told him. "In Columbia Heights or Anacostia, somewhere people can get quality health care without worrying about cost. Sliding scale fees. Preventive care. The kind that changes lives." Hyunjae pulled out his phone, started taking notes. "What would you need?" "Startup funding, a location, staff. Let me support it," he said. "Not buy your dream, support it." And for the first time in months, the future didn't feel terrifying. It felt like possibility. 6 months later, June 2026, Loretta stood in the doorway of her community clinic in Columbia Heights. The sign above the door read, "Cornerstone Community Health." Simple, professional, hers. Hyunjae had provided startup capital as a business investment, but she maintained full control, hired her own staff, set her own policies, built exactly what she'd dreamed of. They were still together, navigating complications, her discomfort with some of his business associates, his gradual steps toward legitimate operations, her firm boundaries around danger. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Yuri never returned. Through his channels, Hyunjae learned she was living quietly in Vancouver, working as a translator. Junseo was safe. Her parents didn't know the full truth. She'd disappeared into an ordinary life, far from the nightmare she'd created. Sometimes people asked Loretta if she regretted speaking up, if she'd do it again, knowing what it would cost. The honest answer? That whisper had cost her sleep, safety, peace of mind for months. But staying silent would have cost her something she couldn't afford to lose, her integrity. You don't become a nurse to watch people die when you can save them. Hyun-jae had changed too. Slowly, deliberately, transitioning his business toward legitimate operations, reducing ties to the organization that had caused so much pain. Loretta hadn't demanded it, but her presence made him want to be someone worthy of her choice. Trust your instincts when something's wrong. Silence might keep you safe in the moment, but action, even terrifying action, can save lives. People aren't just heroes or villains. Sometimes victims become villains. Sometimes villains choose to do better. The world is more complicated than stories usually admit. Real love isn't about grand gestures or rescuing each other. It's about two people choosing honesty, even when it's hard. Building something together, one small choice at a time. On a Sunday morning in late June, Loretta and Hyun-jae walked through the Georgetown Farmers Market, hands loosely linked, debating whether to buy strawberries or blueberries. Ordinary, imperfect, real. She'd whispered 6 words that saved his life. He spent every day after proving she'd saved more than that. She'd saved his capacity to trust, to love, to hope. And sometimes, that's the most powerful medicine of all. Now let me ask you one final question. If you were in Loretta's position, could you have stayed silent to protect your career? Or would you have spoken up, no matter the cost? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the bravest thing we can do is whisper the truth, even when the whole world feels like it's listening. See you in the next one.